A single trembling breath fogged the darkness as I pressed my back deeper into the cold, jagged stone of the cave. My phone was dying, my hands shaking, and there, just beyond the thin line of moonlight, came the sound of my own voice echoing from the woods, calmly calling my name with a tone I'd never use. The next moment hit like a lightning bolt. Flashes of a photo snapped seconds earlier, revealing a pale, unknown figure behind us. The GPS map on my cracked screen spinning wild, insisting we were halfway beneath the earth. And a metallic warning scratched in desperation into an old camp pot, screaming for any sane person to turn back now. But as the voice outside grew louder, blending into the static hiss of my dying phone, one truth hammered through the relentless fear. Whatever was hunting me had always known I'd be here tonight. And this story was only beginning. This is not just one story, but three. And each is real, each is worse than the last. So if you think it can't get any stranger or scarier, wait and see what happens next. Story 1. The Parallel Trail. At 2:47 p.m. on June 14th, Jen Reeves stood on the Peralta Trail in Arizona's Superstition Mountains, staring at her GPS in disbelief as it insisted she was standing 200 feet underwater in the middle of the desert. The map spinning like the device was rejecting reality itself. While beside her, her best friend Becca said her own phone now showed they weren't on any established trail at all. Just a blinking blue dot floating in blank space. The wooden mile marker beside them read 3.2, a number they were both certain they had already passed at least twice. And as Jen realized her watch had been frozen on 2:47 for what felt like half an hour, the air around them began to feel heavy and muffled, as if sound itself was being soaked up by the heat-baked rock. But what happened next changed everything. And to understand how they ended up trapped in that impossible moment, you have to go back to that morning, when it was still just another Instagram-worthy desert hike. The day had started perfectly, a cool blue dawn over the jagged outline of the Superstition Mountains, a dusty parking lot filling slowly with sleepy hikers tightening their bootlaces, and the faint smell of sunscreen and gasoline mixing with desert dust as car doors slammed shut. Jen and Becca, both 27, climbed out of Becca's old Subaru buzzing with caffeine and nerves, the kind of excited energy you have when you're experienced enough to think you know what you're doing, but not seasoned enough to truly respect how quickly a landscape like this can turn on you. They signed their names in the trail register, made a couple of jokes about disappearing like those superstition legends, then posed for a quick selfie under the wooden Peralta trailhead sign. Sun just cresting the ridge behind them, packs still clean, boots not yet coated in the fine red dust that would cling to everything by afternoon. From the first steps, the trail felt like a highlight reel, packed earth winding between tall saguaro, the metallic clack of trekking poles on scattered stones, the faint hiss of cicadas starting up in the warming air, and the ridgeline ahead slowly revealing its serrated silhouette as they climbed. Jen checked her new Garmin GPS watch every few minutes, calling out their elevation and pace with mock professionalism, while Becca bounced ahead, stopping to frame shots of Chola, Ocotillo, and the long, snaking line of hikers below them. By the time they reached their first rest spot, a flat rock overlooking the canyon, the parking lot was a tiny plastic smear in the distance, and the only sounds were wind, boots, and the occasional distant voice from a switchback far below. It was on one of those switchbacks, maybe an hour and a half in, that the first thing happened. Becca spotted a jagged, rust-colored boulder shaped uncannily like a clenched fist, and insisted Jen stand beside it for a photo. Jen smirked, planted a trekking pole, and did a mock conqueror pose while Becca snapped a burst of photos. It was so normal that Jen didn't bother checking the pictures right away. She just shouldered her pack and started up the next turn in the trail, only noticing after a few moments that Becca had gone quiet. "What?" Jen asked, slightly out of breath. "You okay?" Becca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked up beside Jen and wordlessly turned her phone so Jen could see the last photo. Jen expected the usual, her own sweaty face, the fist-shaped rock, maybe some lens flare, but instead she saw herself mid-pose and behind her in the center of the trail about 20 feet down, a blurred figure in a red jacket. The figure was mid-stride, 1 foot forward, head slightly tilted toward the camera, just out of focus enough that you couldn't see their features clearly, except there was an impression of pale skin and a dark shape where the eyes should be. Every hair on Jen's arms stood up. They both knew there hadn't been anyone behind her. The trail had been empty. The last hikers they'd seen were a pair of retirees they'd passed 15 minutes back, both in light-colored clothing, and they would have heard someone that close. Maybe someone came up while I was looking at the screen, Becca offered weakly, but there was doubt in her voice. They turned and scanned the switchbacks below. Empty trail. No red jacket, no movement at all. For a long moment they just stood there, listening to their own breathing and the faint whine of wind around the rocks before Jen shook it off with forced bravado. "We're in a tourist trap of a mountain," she said. "Some guy in a red jacket doesn't mean we're cursed." They laughed, but only superficially, and when they started hiking again, both of them checked over their shoulders more often than before. The next couple of hours passed in a strange balance of beauty and unease. The sun climbed higher, baking the exposed sections of trail so that waves of heat shimmered above the rocks. The soil shifted from tan to deeper red. The saguaros gave way to more jagged rock and low shrubs clinging to the slope. They ate snacks in a narrow patch of shade, watching a vulture circle lazily above a distant ridge. Every so often they'd pass another hiker, exchange simple greetings, and feel briefly reassured. Other people, other phones, other realities moving normally. Around late morning, somewhere near what Jen's watch told her was mile 3, they encountered a middle-aged man in a blue Columbia jacket and a faded diamondback's cap. He was sweating heavily but smiling, hiking poles clicking rhythmically as he descended. They stepped aside on the narrow trail to let him pass, and he offered a quick, "You ladies headed up to the saddle? Worth it. Just watch the heat." His voice was friendly, ordinary. They nodded, thanked him, and kept moving. That was normal. What happened 20 minutes later was not. The trail had become steeper, hugging a rock wall on one side with a steep drop on the other. Jen's calves burned and her breathing had taken on a steady, manageable rhythm when she saw someone up ahead coming toward them. Blue jacket, diamondback's cap. Same man, same gait, same easy pole clicks. For a second, Jen's brain blanked, like a skipped frame in a film reel. She glanced at Becca, who had stopped mid-step, her expression mirroring Jen's disbelief. "Didn't we just—" Jen began. "Yeah," Becca whispered. "We did." When they met this second version of the man, there was no sign he recognized them. He didn't even look surprised. "Hotter than they said it'd be," he puffed, stepping aside slightly so they could pass. The interaction was nearly identical to before, like a subtle echo with tiny differences in wording. "Weren't you just heading down?" Jen blurted, unable to help herself. The man frowned as if she'd asked something nonsensical. "Been going up since dawn," he said. "Must have seen someone else." Then he continued on, passing them and disappearing around a bend in the direction they'd come from. The moment he was out of earshot, Becca opened her phone with shaking hands to find the earlier photo for proof, the one of the man from their first encounter. When she scrolled, her hand stopped completely. The photo wasn't there. Neither was the shot of Jen with the red jacket figure behind her. In their place, 2 images had appeared that neither of them remembered taking. The trail ahead, empty, framed the same way twice. Only in one of them, the footprints in the dust seemed to lead both up and down at once, overlapping each other in an odd, trampled pattern. A creeping thought Jen didn't want to voice pushed at her. What if the photos weren't changing? What if the trail itself was? They pressed on anyway, choosing a kind of stubborn denial over panic. That denial tore open at mile marker 3.2. The first time they passed it, they barely registered the weathered wooden post beyond snapping a quick picture of it. The second time, the same post appeared ahead when it shouldn't have. The rock beside it, an angular chunk with a distinctive white quartz vein, was unmistakable. Did we loop back? Becca asked, looking around. The path behind them showed only their own footprints. No spurs, no junctions they could have taken by mistake. Jen checked her watch. 2:47 p.m. The time didn't match her sense of the day, but that was easy to blame on exertion and heat. Maybe the map's off, she said. But when they kept walking, the canyon walls looked less like a trail and more like a track whose scenery had been copy-pasted. 10, maybe 15 minutes later, still heading down toward what should have been the parking lot, they saw 3.2 again. The same post, the same rock with the white vein, the same slight tilt of the sign like it was leaning away from them. Jen's mouth went dry. This time, she checked her watch immediately. 2:47 p.m. The second hand ticked once, then froze. Becca's phone showed 2:47 as well. She locked it, unlocked it, and the time remained stubbornly unchanged. A wave of nausea rolled through Jen's stomach as her brain tried to reconcile the sweat on her skin, the burn in her legs, the feeling of time passing, with the instruments telling her that nothing was moving forward. "We're heat stroking," she said, willing it to be true, but the air wasn't hazy enough and she wasn't dizzy in the right way. Becca swallowed hard. "Let's just go faster. We'll be at the car soon, okay?" They speed-walked. The canyon bends repeated themselves like a dream where you keep opening the same door to the same room. A dead tree fell across the valley floor in the exact same position, its bleached branches pointing like bones. A pair of rocks that looked like a broken jaw appeared again. And then, there was 3.2. Again, this time they didn't talk. Fear had fully set in. Their bodies told them they'd been descending for at least 40 minutes. Their tech insisted they hadn't moved at all. As they stood there, heartbeats loud in their ears, they heard something that sliced through the hot stillness like a knife. Voices up ahead, laughing, faint but clear. Relief hit first. Other people. Maybe their devices were just glitching. Maybe they'd walked in a circle and hadn't noticed. Being with other hikers would anchor them. They followed the sound around a bend, picking up their pace. When they saw who it was, Jen's legs almost gave out. 2 women were coming up the trail toward them, chatting easily. One in a gray t-shirt and black leggings, brown hair in a messy bun, a teal pack on her shoulders. The other in a faded green top and blue shorts, dark braid, maroon pack, camera clipped to the strap. Their faces, their gaits, even the small scar on the calf just above one boot, it was them. Not similar women, not lookalikes. Them. Jen watched herself laugh at something Becca said, their voices drifting up in words she couldn't quite make out, as though the soundtrack were slightly misaligned from the picture. The versions of them approaching didn't see the shocked pair standing in the middle of the trail ahead, as if in their version of the path, Jen and Becca simply weren't there. Jen tasted metal in her mouth. "We're leaving," Becca hissed, grabbing her arm. "Now!" Without waiting for the other pair to reach them, they lunged off the trail, stumbling down the loose slope, rocks skittering underfoot, cactus spines snagging at their clothes. Somewhere behind them, one of the other voices said something that might have been, "Where'd they go?" But Jen refused to look back. The desert off-trail was harsher than the path had suggested. Ankle-breaking stones hidden under scrub. Barrel cacti bristling like landmines. Dry washes that seemed shallow until you realized they were 10 feet deep with crumbly sides. They half ran, half slid, aiming in what Jen thought was a diagonal that would eventually intersect a different section of the trail or a service road. Her watch was useless now, stuck at 2:47. The sun, however, moved inexorably across the sky, searing the tops of their shoulders, making the air shimmer. Time felt both stretched and compressed, like a rubber band pulled too far. At some point, Becca's lips cracked and she admitted she had less than half a liter of water left. Jen's calves cramped and then went numb. Still footsteps and the faint echo of their own laughter seemed to follow them at a distance, always just behind a ridge or around a boulder, like the loop refused to let them go. The ground finally began to level out near the mouth of a wash. A dull roar reached their ears, the distant hum of cars on a road. That sound broke whatever remained of the trail's hold on them. They scrambled toward it, using yucca and scrub for handholds, ignoring fresh scratches and the burn of sweat in their eyes. When they crested a last low rise and saw the parking lot below, white lines, scattered vehicles, a restroom building squatting in the sun, Jen nearly sobbed. The roar of traffic from a highway beyond was the sweetest, ugliest sound she'd ever heard. They staggered downhill, slipping more than walking, and spilled out onto the hot asphalt like shipwreck survivors crawling onto a beach. A couple loading gear into a truck stared openly. "You guys okay?" the man called, concern creasing his forehead. Jen tried to answer and found her voice ragged, words sticking in her dry throat. They managed to nod, wave off offers of water with shaking hands, and collapse beside Becca's car, hands braced on their knees, hearts still thudding with leftover adrenaline, and an animal fear that didn't care how normal the world looked now. When Jen finally had enough control to check her watch, the display read 6:23 p.m., the seconds finally ticking forward like normal. Becca unlocked the car, grabbed a spare bottle of water and handed it to Jen, then pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she opened the photo gallery. Every picture from the hike, the fist-shaped rock, the selfie by the sign, the panoramic views, was gone. In their place were just 3 images. The first was of the trail register at the start, zoomed tight on the signature section. Their names were visible, written in their own handwriting, but not just once. 4 entries stacked one after another with bizarre, inconsistent dates and times. One read 8:02 a.m. June 14th, another read 2:47 p.m. June 14th. A third showed 2:47 p.m. June 14th, but with a year, a decade ahead. The last had a date that hadn't happened yet at all. The second photo was of the empty trail and the 3.2-mile marker, taken from an angle neither of them remembered standing in, the sky above it strangely washed out. The third was the worst. A shot looking down, at the trail from somewhere upslope, Jen and Becca visible in the frame, trudging along with their backs turned, and behind them, far down the path, a second pair of figures in the exact same clothes, walking the same direction. Jen scrolled again and again, hoping for a glitch, another folder, some explanation. There was nothing, just those 3 impossible images. They left without talking about it, driving in stunned silence as the mountains shrank in the rearview mirror, the ink-black outline of the Superstition swallowing the sun one more time. For weeks afterward, Jen tried to rationalize what had happened. Heat exhaustion, faulty gear, a shared hallucination triggered by stress. But sometimes at night she'd wake up, check her phone on the bedside table, and catch the lock screen stuck on 2:47 before it flickered and corrected itself. Once, half asleep and not thinking, she opened her photos, and for just a second she thought she saw a new image. Herself, standing on a desert trail she hadn't walked yet, mile marker 3.2 just behind her, with 2 more figures way down the line. By the time she blinked and tried to look again, it was gone. She hasn't gone hiking since, and neither of them talks about that day out loud, because deep down, They both have the same sick thought. What if a version of them never made it back to the parking lot? What if somewhere in those mountains there is a branch of the trail where it's still 2:47 p.m., where the sun never moves, where two women keep passing mile marker 3.2 over and over, occasionally catching glimpses of themselves coming the other way on a parallel path that never quite lines up? And if you're not careful, if you don't respect the strange reputation of the superstitions, you might just step onto the wrong version of that trail and never leave. Story 2. The Marking Tree. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of fabric ripping, a long, clean tear that vibrated through the thin nylon of my tent like someone was slowly drawing a knife from top to bottom. And for a second I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, heart pounding so hard I could hear blood in my ears, convinced I was still dreaming, until the cold October air of the Olympic National Forest poured in and slapped that idea out of me. My name is Marcus Caldwell, I'm 34, and by that point I'd been backpacking solo for over a decade without a single real emergency. No rescues, no search parties, just sprained ankles and bad weather. So when I tell you that what happened to me in the Kino backcountry last fall has made me seriously consider never camping alone again, understand that I'm not easily shaken. But what happened that night changed everything. And to understand why I still wake up sometimes checking my bedroom walls for carvings in the dark, I have to go back to how that trip started, when this was supposed to be nothing more than 4 quiet days off-grid in the rain-soaked cathedral of the Olympic National Park. I hit the Graves Creek trailhead just after noon on October 27th, the sky a solid slab of gray, mist hanging between the trunks like smoke, everything smelling of wet cedar and moss. The Enchanted Valley route is popular in summer, but by late October the crowds are gone. The ranger at the small station had looked at my permit and shrugged. "You're probably not going to see many folks out there this time of year," she said. "Watch the rivers and the wind. Lot of deadfall if a storm rolls in." That was exactly what I wanted. Silence, fog, maybe an elk or two in the distance. I signed the backcountry register, slung my pack, around 30 pounds with food and gear, and started up the trail under a canopy so thick in places it felt like stepping into a green tunnel. The first day was textbook. I passed a couple heading out, their ponchos flapping as they hustled for the parking lot before the next band of rain. After that, it was just me and the forest, the soft thunk of my boots in the mud, the drip of condensation from massive big-leaf maples, the constant hush of the Quinault River somewhere off to my left. Every so often the trees would part and I'd catch a glimpse of water churning gray and white over slick stones, disappearing again behind curtains of ferns taller than my chest. I made camp in a designated spot near the valley floor, hung my food properly, cooked a quick meal on my little stove, and fell asleep to the steady patter of rain on the fly and the occasional distant bugle of elk, feeling nothing but that deep, contented fatigue you get when your world has shrunk to the beam of your headlamp and the warmth of your sleeping bag. Day 2, the weather lifted a little, and with it I pushed deeper along a less maintained spur that my map marked only as unofficial. Route, experienced hikers only. That label was basically a dare to me. The trail, if you could still call it that, became more of a suggestion, a faint boot track through sword ferns, the occasional sawed log, the distant glow of an old blaze on a trunk so choked in moss you'd miss it if you weren't searching. Around midday I started noticing rock piles, small cairns that obviously weren't Park Service work. Rangers in the Olympics use flagging tape or standardized markers. These were 3 or 5 stones stacked in odd little formations at the edges of game trails and dry creek beds. At first, I dismissed them as signs from other hikers, maybe angling toward a known campsite or fishing spot. But they didn't behave like normal trail markers. Instead of pointing toward easier going, they seemed to pull you toward denser brush and steeper slopes. The pattern caught my eye. 3 stones on one pile, 5 on the next, then 3 again, always that sequence. And they weren't fresh. Some were lichen-covered, others half sunk into the soil as if they'd been there years. I felt a tickle of unease but kept going, telling myself I'd turn back if anything felt actually dangerous. By late afternoon, the sky started to bruise purple, and I found a small clearing tucked against a rock face. A perfect windbreak with just enough flat ground for my tent. I set up, cooked, checked my GPS and paper map twice, and went through my normal routine. Hang food, tidy camp, crawl into the bag with a book until my eyes blurred. Sometime around 2 in the morning, nature called. I fumbled for my headlamp, unzipped the tent, and stepped into the damp chill with my breath puffing in a pale cloud. That was when I saw the circle around my camp. Roughly 10 feet beyond the tent, encircling the whole clearing, were cairns, dozens of them, each no taller than my shin, each composed of the same pattern of stones I'd been seeing all day. 3 on the bottom, 5 stacked precariously above, then 3 more perched on top like a crown. They hadn't been there at dusk. I was certain of that. I'd walked the perimeter before picking my spot. My headlamp beam jittered as my hand shook, sweeping from one tiny stack to another, tracing the rough ring they formed around my tent like a boundary line. Between them, my light caught faint lines scratched into the soil itself. Not footprints, not animal tracks, but crude symbols etched by hand or stick. They looked almost like a child's drawing of antlers or crooked branches, intersecting circles and lines that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some other backpacker with a twisted sense of humor had snuck in after dark. But the nearest other permitted parties, according to the ranger station, were miles away. And there were no boot prints in the mud except mine. My scalp prickled as if the damp air had turned electric. Every horror story cliché flashed through my mind, and I hated that because I'm the kind of person who prides himself on not being spooked by superstition. I forced a laugh that sounded too loud in the trees, told myself I'd just missed the cairns earlier, took care of business, and crawled back into the tent, zipping it all the way down like a child pulling a blanket up over his head. I lay awake longer than I'd admit, listening to the forest, the creak of trees in the wind, the drip of condensation, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance that I tried very hard to attribute to deer or elk. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under. That's when the sound of ripping fabric yanked me back. It wasn't a branch snagging the rainfly, it was deliberate, slow, steady, traveling the length of the tent wall inches from my face. I froze, breathing shallowly, brain white-hot with panic but body refusing to move. The next second, the cold hit me. The side panel slumped inward and split, letting in a knife of night air and the smell of wet bark and something else, something like old, turned earth. Adrenaline cut the paralysis. I fumbled for my headlamp, thumbed it on, and spun toward the breach, expecting to see a bare snout. A cougar's eyes, something with weight and teeth. The beam cut through mist and caught nothing. No animal, no person. Just the sagging edge of my tent sheared from ceiling to floor, flapping softly, and beyond that, the trees. The circle of cairns was gone. In its place, surrounding my camp in a wider ring, were trees marked with symbols. Every trunk within 20 feet had been carved into since I'd gone to sleep. Deep gashes in the bark formed those same crooked antler shapes, spirals intersected with radiating lines, crude human-like figures missing their heads. Sap bled from the wounds, glowing amber in my cone of light. In the very center of the clearing, dead center where there had been nothing when I pitched my tent, stood a narrow, completely bark-stripped trunk about 8 feet tall, jammed up right into the soil like a pole. Carved into it from about knee level to chest height was a single enormous spiral, and inside that spiral in tight, shallow strokes were tally marks, 4 vertical grooves crossed by a 5th, repeated over and over in uneven rows. I counted 23 before my brain refused to process more. My satellite messenger sat in the corner of the tent, silently accusing me of my earlier cockiness. Hands shaking so hard I could barely hit the buttons, I triggered an SOS and waited for the tiny device to blink its comforting message sent confirmation. It flashed red instead. No signal. I lifted it above my head, turned in a slow circle, tried again. No signal. I'd checked the same unit only hours earlier and had full coverage. I thumbed the power off and on like that would magically fix something. No signal. Somewhere out beyond the marked trees, something moved. Not close enough to see, but close. Enough that I felt it, like the forest exhaled in one direction. A soft crunch of wet needles, the faintest suggestion of weight shifting. My survival brain made the decision for me. I didn't roll up the sleeping pad. I didn't take down the tent. I grabbed my headlamp, knife, water filter, a single bottle, and my map, shoved them into my day pack with barely enough coordination to zip it, and stepped into my boots without lacing them properly. The carved trees seemed to lean in as I passed them, their wounds glistening. Every primitive instinct screamed at me not to break into a run, to walk, to act like prey that hadn't yet realized it was prey, but the second I cleared the ring, I heard it. Footsteps matching mine, just out of sight. Slow when I slowed, faster when I sped up. Heavy enough that they weren't imagination, but light enough to feel wrong, like someone carrying less weight than a full-grown human should. I broke. Panic detonated whatever rational strategy I'd had. I bolted into the darkness, headlamp beam bouncing wildly through fog and branches, boots slipping in mud as I aimed myself toward where I thought the main trail should be, using my memory of the river's sound as a distant guide. The footsteps followed, never closer, never farther, just mirroring me at the edge of the circle of light, occasionally veering off and then reappearing, always on my periphery. Once my beam caught a flash of movement between 2 trunks, something tall and pale sliding behind a cedar. But when I whipped the light back, there was only the shredded husk of a fallen log and night beyond. I don't know how long I ran like that, just that at some point my lungs burned so badly I thought I might pass out. I forced myself to slow to a fast walk, to orient with my compass, to listen. That's when I saw it, a tree even bigger than the rest, rising out of the darkness like a pillar. The beam of my headlamp climbed its trunk and revealed what I now think of as the marking tree. Its base, from root flare to about 8 feet up, was a history of scratches. Hundreds of symbols carved over what looked like many years, some fresh and bright, others dark and weathered. Between the cryptic shapes in shaky human handwriting were words. Names, dates. Turned back 1987. Left food 1993. Watcher took him 2003. One message, nearly worn away by time, simply read, "Stay out of its circle," with an arrow crudely carved pointing back the way I'd come. Above those, carved more recently, maybe in the last few years, were initials and numbers. The kind of thing bored hikers sometimes do, except these looked more like records. JD heard it whistle. LS lost 2 nights. M+T ran, got away. There was no official trail marker, no ranger sign, nothing that acknowledged the tree existed, but in that moment I understood. The piles of stones, the symbols around my camp, this massive totem of warnings, they weren't threats, they were boundaries, lines drawn by whatever lived here, or by people who'd met it, saying this far, no farther. My chest heaved as I stood there, light shaking over all those scratched pleas and cautions. Behind me, deeper in the forest, something stepped on a branch and didn't bother to hide the sound. The spell broke. I didn't pray. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say. I just picked a bearing that would angle me toward the main valley and started walking as fast as my screaming legs could manage, forcing myself not to run so I didn't snap an ankle, not to glance back so I didn't catch even a glimpse of whatever paced me at a distance. Dawn was a slow gray seep through the canopy. When the trees finally thinned enough that I recognized the official Enchanted Valley Trail, a wide, boot-packed ribbon of mud bordered by weathered wooden signs, I could have collapsed from sheer relief. The footsteps were gone. The forest sounded normal again. Birds, squirrels, the quiet rush of wind in high branches. Behind me, within the depths of the valley, the marking tree and the circle I'd spent the night in might as well have been part of a different world. I made it back to Graves Creek by late afternoon, muscles shaking with every step. The ranger who'd checked my permit 2 days earlier was there, sitting on the hood of her truck, filling out a log. She frowned when she saw me, mud-streaked, wild-eyed, missing half my gear. "You cut your trip short?" she said, half-question. I opened my mouth to give some half-truth, but what came out instead was the whole thing in one hoarse rush. The cairns, the symbols, the shredded tent, the carved trees, the footsteps, the marking tree with its tally marks and scratched messages. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift from standard, another spooked tourist skepticism to something else. When I mentioned the tally marks on the strip trunk near my camp, 23 of them, her eyes flicked away for half a second, calculating. "You sure you counted right?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," I said, 23. She nodded once like I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected, then told me to wait while she made a call. She stepped away, spoke low into her radio where I couldn't hear, came back and handed me a bottle of water. "Officially," she said, "I'm going to write this up as you hearing things in the wind and getting spooked by old vandalism. Unofficially, I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell the few people who come out of that side of the valley talking about circles and carvings. Don't camp off designated sites in that drainage again. Better yet, don't go back there at all." I asked her if she'd ever seen the marking tree. She held my gaze for a long moment, then shrugged one shoulder. "There are a lot of big trees in this park," she said. "Some of them have stories tied to them. I can't stop people from going where they want, but we get patterns. Missing pets from nearby cabins, unexplained sounds on clear nights, and every decade or so some experienced backpacker comes storming out of there saying something was circling their camp and the forest was marked. You're the first one in a while to mention tally marks, though." She didn't say it, but I heard it anyway. 23 marks, 23 stories, maybe not all of them with endings as lucky as mine. I drove home that evening in a fog, the wipers squeaking over intermittent drizzle, my shredded tent crumpled in the back like shed skin. For weeks I tried to convince myself I'd overreacted, that a vandal had messed with my camp and the rest was panic. But some nights I'll wake up for no reason at 3:17 a.m., the exact time I looked at my watch as the knife cut my tent open, and I'll lie there in the dark listening, half expecting to hear the soft scrape of something circling my apartment, testing the boundaries. In those moments I can almost smell that mix of sap and wet bark again. I haven't bought a new tent. I haven't been back to Olympic. And when people ask me why I don't do solo trips anymore, I just tell them I've done my share and leave it at that. Because the real answer is simple and impossible at the same time. Out there in a shadowed fork of the Enchanted Valley, there's a tree covered in warnings and tally marks. And I have this sick feeling that one of those small, shallow grooves, etched by a hand I'll never see, is there because of me. Story 3. The Rescue Call. I was crouched in the back of a shallow bear cave off the Appalachian Trail, my spine pressed against damp rock that smelled like old leaves and something rotting. My phone screen dimmed down to a dying sliver at 2% battery. when I heard my own voice calling from the trees outside. Same timbre, same slight rasp, saying, "David? David, where are you? I need help," in a tone I knew I hadn't used, and in that moment I understood that whatever had been hunting me in the Great Smoky Mountains all afternoon had finally learned exactly how I sounded. 12 hours earlier, it had been a perfect spring morning at Newfound Gap, the kind of day where the parking lot is full of rental cars and day packs, and tourists pose beside the big elevation sign without realizing how fast the weather can flip up here. I was 29, a former Eagle Scout with more laminated maps than social skills, doing a simple out-and-back solo hike along the Appalachian Trail to Charlie's Bunyan and back, about 15 miles total, an easy flex for someone who prided himself on being that prepared guy in his friend group. The air was cool, mid-50s, a little mist clinging in the folds of the ridge, and I'd done everything by the book. Signed the trail register at Newfound Gap, told my sister I'd text her when I was back at the car, packed 3 liters of water, a basic first aid kit, a Garmin GPS, a lightweight emergency bivvy, and a knife I mostly used for cutting salami and paracord. The AT out of the Gap is civilized at first. Well-worn tread, log steps, the occasional white blaze on a tree reassuring you that you're on the right path. And by mid-morning, I'd fallen into that easy, rhythmic headspace where your thoughts just drift between boot steps and bird song. I stopped at Icewater Spring Shelter around 10:30 a.m., chatted with a couple of section hikers from Ohio who were debating pushing farther north, refilled my water, signed the shelter log with the usual "all good," headed to the Bunyan, and pushed on, feeling completely in control, completely safe, the way people do right before everything goes sideways. It happened maybe a mile past the shelter, in a section where the trail narrows to a spine, with steep drop-offs disappearing into rhododendron hell on both sides. I was focused on my footing when a sound floated up from the left side down in the tangle, a man's voice, thin with pain but loud enough to be unmistakable. "Help. Please. I'm hurt." The words hit that part of my brain that had been drilled with "be prepared" and "leave no one behind" since Boy Scouts. I stopped dead. "Hey," I shouted back. "Where are you?" The reply came immediately, a little stronger. "Down here, slipped off the trail, and I think my leg's broken. Please, man, please." Looking over the edge, all I could see was a wall of rhododendron and laurel, green and glossy and nearly impenetrable. Every bit of official safety advice I'd ever read said don't go off trail, especially in the Smokies where one bad step can send you tumbling. But there's a line between smart caution and leaving someone to die because it's inconvenient. I marked my location on the GPS, told myself I'd cut down just far enough to see him, and started bushwhacking into the brush, branches clawing at my jacket and pack straps. The voice kept talking, guiding me. "A little more left. Yeah, like that. Keep coming. I can see your light through the leaves." The way he always sounded the same distance away didn't register as wrong until much later. At the time, I was too busy not snapping an ankle on hidden rocks. 10-15 minutes of fighting the undergrowth left me scratched, sweating, and disoriented, with no clear view back up to the trail. That's when I saw the backpack. It lay half-covered in leaf litter against the base of a tree like it had been dropped and then slowly swallowed by the forest. It was a blue osprey, decent size, sun-faded in places, the kind of pack serious hikers use. "Is this your pack?" I called out, already reaching for it. The voice answered instantly, same level, same distance, too smooth. Yeah, that's mine. Please, I'm just down the hill, man, hurry." My stomach tightened around a feeling that had nothing to do with exertion. The more my brain focused on the sound, the more it noticed that there were no gasps, no groans, no rustle of someone shifting position between calls, just the same exact cadence, almost like a loop. I unzipped the main compartment of the pack, and everything I thought I knew about where I was and what I was doing slid sideways. Inside were things that didn't belong together. A bunch of old energy bar wrappers, a mold-stained bandana, some spare socks, and, at the bottom, a handful of driver's licenses rubber-banded together. The plastic edges warped as if they'd been damp for a long time. 14 IDs, all from different states, all with different faces and names, the most recent expiration dates only a year or two out. Under the bundle were phones, at least 8, some shattered, some just dead, different models and ages piled like someone had been tossing them in as trophies. On top of the mess, like a cherry on top of a garbage sundae, sat a small, black handheld radio, its speaker grating out the words I'd been hearing in a tinny, slightly staticky male voice. "Help. Please. I'm hurt. I think my leg's broken. Please, man, please." The exact same inflections I'd been following, trailing off and starting again with mechanical precision every 20 seconds. My mouth went dry. The forest seemed to press in. This wasn't a hiker in trouble, this was bait. I didn't answer it. I backed away from the pack, heart slamming against my ribs, and that's when I heard a new sound. Not the fake plea, but the heavy, deliberate crunch of a human footstep above me on the slope, between me and where I knew the AT ran. Someone else was in the brush now, someone who'd obviously expected me to keep going down toward the voice, not stop to look inside the backpack. Panic and training collided in my brain. I knew from land nav practice that the AT ran roughly along the ridge. I knew from the map that if I wrapped around the contour instead of climbing straight back up into whoever was blocking the way, I might intersect a side spur or at least give myself some space. Without thinking it through any further, I turned away from the direction of the footstep and angled downslope and right, moving as quietly as I could through the rhododendron. Branches whipped my face, snagged my clothes, tried to hold me in place, and behind me a second set of footsteps started matching my change in direction. Slow, patient, never rushing. The fake wounded voice cut out mid-loop. For the next hour, my world shrank to the small circle of forest right in front of me and the sounds behind and occasionally above. I didn't run blind. I moved in bursts, pausing to listen like I'd been taught when we practiced evasion scenarios in scouts and later on my own trips. Whenever I stopped, the other person eventually stopped too, like they didn't want to close the distance too fast. A couple of times I heard a soft crackle and realized they had a radio too. Once, through the green filter of leaves, I saw the faintest hint of movement. A darker shape where the light should have been solid, a hint of camo pattern that might have been clothing, then nothing. The sun shifted, climbing high and then slowly tilting west, shadows stretching weirdly long across the slopes. I checked my phone once when I found a brief hole in the canopy. 1 bar of signal, then gone. The battery ticked down to single digits. I killed the screen and kept going, aiming for where I knew a spur trail descended toward a different overlook. Eventually, the floor of the ravine I'd been skirting flattened out into a narrow, rocky drainage, and in the wall of moss-slick rock to my right, I saw a dark notch. A shallow cave, really just a bear den scooped out under an overhang, big enough to crawl into, small enough that there was only one way in or out. Every caution brochure I'd ever read screamed, "Never approach bear dens," but every instinct that had been listening to the footsteps all afternoon screamed this might be the only place I could control an approach, even for a few hours. I checked for scat and fresh tracks at the mouth. Nothing obvious, just old leaves and the smoky, earthy smell of long-dried musk. And squeezed myself inside, turning so I could see the entrance, knife in one hand, phone in the other. From inside, the outside world shrank to a trapezoid of filtered green and gray, branches moving gently in the breeze like curtains. My breathing sounded too loud, so I focused on slowing it, on counting it, on listening. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Somewhere out in the brush, a twig snapped. A figure moved between two trees just far enough that I couldn't make out details, but close enough to know it wasn't my imagination. A person, thin, wearing something mottled that blended with the understory. Head cocked as if sniffing the air. They moved soundlessly past the cave without looking in, threads of fear and relief tangling in my gut. My phone buzzed once in my hand, a low battery warning popping up like a bad joke. 3%. I turned it to airplane mode, dimmed the screen, decided I'd wait for full dark before risking a call, when it would be harder for someone to see the glow. Dusk in the Smokies comes all at once, shadows flooding the hollows, birds going quiet. By the time the last smear of light had faded from the cave mouth, the forest outside sounded different. Distant barred owls calling, "Who cooks for you?" The occasional rustle of a small animal, and under that a new noise, a faint electronic hiss, the soft crackle of a speaker warming up. Then a voice. "David? David, can you hear me?" My own voice. The exact intonation I'd used hours earlier when I first called down to the injured hiker. I felt my throat close. My tongue moved against the roof of my mouth in a dry, involuntary swallow. The recording played again, slightly louder, moving slowly through the trees. "David, David, where are you? I need help." It wasn't answered by footsteps this time. The footsteps and the voice traveled together, circling the drainage like a predator testing scents. Whoever had the radio had either been close enough to record me from the trail or had a directional mic. Either way, they had turned my instinct to help into another tool in their kit. Every fiber of me wanted to yell back some variation of, "I'm not falling for it," but that would have been the same mistake I'd almost made the first time. So I stayed still, muscles cramping, back pressed to stone, breath coming in tiny, shallow pulls through my nose. The voice passed once, twice, each time slightly farther away, then closer again like they were running a grid. At some point during that awful looping search, my phone slipped from 2% to black. The cave went truly dark. Time stopped being a series of minutes and turned into an endless smear of listening and trying not to cough, trying not to shift my weight when a hip bone went numb. At some point in the night, I heard another human sound, a low murmur as if the hunter had started talking quietly into their radio to someone else, words too soft to make out, tone annoyed like things weren't going according to plan. Rain moved in before dawn, a fine mist blowing into the mouth of the cave, dampening my hair and jacket. Around the same time, the forest's tone changed again. Instead of probing crackles and deliberate steps, there was just the ordinary shuffle of small animals and the distant whoosh of cars from some unseen road. The radio voice had gone silent. I waited until the gray outside was strong enough to cast faint texture on the cave walls, counted to 300 in my head twice, then inched forward on stiff legs. The drainage looked different in daylight. Less like a trap, more like a rough, rocky gully that any experienced hiker would respect but not fear. I saw no sign of another person, no boot prints clear enough to pick out in the leaf litter, no dropped gear, no flash of movement. That didn't mean they weren't still out there, but the longer I stayed, the more I was at their mercy. I climbed. It was slow, careful work hauling myself through the thickets back toward where I believed the AT would be, checking my compass against the slope whenever I could see the sky. My sense of time was wrecked, but my body told me I'd been awake for most of the night, that my muscles were one bad move from locking up. The first time I heard other voices, normal voices, my legs nearly gave out. 2 day hikers in clean clothes and small packs appeared on the trail above me as I burst from the brush like something half feral. The look on their faces told me I probably matched that description. Mud up to my knees, small cuts all over my arms, eyes too wide. Hey, are you okay?" one of them asked, stepping back a little but not running. I latched onto them like a drowning man grabs a rope, babbling something about someone using recordings, about a backpack, about IDs. They traded a nervous look but didn't bolt. Instead, they walked with me the last miles back to Newfound Gap, letting me rejoin the stream of oblivious tourists snapping selfies. The normalcy of the parking lot hitting me so hard I actually laughed once, sharp and humorless. At the ranger station, it took a while to get someone to really listen. The first guy manning the desk gave me the patient half-smile reserved for people who've scared themselves in the woods. But when he saw the shelter log with my entry, heard the coordinates I'd marked before leaving the trail, and watched my hands shake as I described the radio, his expression tightened, and he brought in a supervisor. They took a report. They sent a team out. A couple days later, one of the rangers called me with a voice that had all the official emotion pressed flat out of it. They'd found the drainage. They'd found the blue pack. They'd found the pile of licenses and phones. They'd found remnants of a crude campsite farther down, a fire ring, a bit of plastic tarp shredded and half buried, some rusted cans, footprints stomped into an unintelligible mess, but no person. When they ran the names from the IDs, more than half matched open missing persons cases from the region going back nearly a decade. Solo hikers, trail runners. A guy who'd gone out to photograph wildflowers and never come back. There were no neat endings, no arrests announced, just a quiet recommendation that people stick to the main trail corridors and report any strange calls for help to rangers instead of diving off into the brush alone. Even now, months later, I sometimes jolt awake in my apartment to the phantom sound of my own voice echoing from the hallway, calling for help in that flat, recorded way. I tell myself it's just my brain replaying the worst day of my life, but a part of me always lies there listening, straining for the crunch of a footstep that doesn't belong on my carpet. Out in the Smokies, that drainage is still there, and so are the faint scars of a camp used for years by someone patient enough to let people walk themselves into his trap. Maybe he moved on when the rangers got too close. Maybe he's still out there, radio charged, new script recorded, waiting for the next prepared hiker who can't bring himself to ignore a cry for help.